The year 1066 stands out as a landmark in English history, for it witnessed a decisive chain of events that reshaped the political and cultural fabric of the realm. In the opening months of that year, an atmosphere of uncertainty and anticipation pervaded the royal courts, the countryside manors, and the bustling towns of Anglo-Saxon England. Many people at the time sensed that dramatic changes were looming. For generations, English monarchs had consolidated power and authority through the council of nobles, church leaders, and well-established traditions. Yet, beneath this surface of relative stability lay unresolved questions about succession, alliances, and the rightful heirs to the throne. As new claimants began to emerge and foreign powers watched from across the Channel, 1066 became the stage for an epic confrontation. Throughout Anglo-Saxon England, the sense of continuity with the ancient past ran deep. Noble families traced their lineages back through centuries of warfare, king-making, and rivalry, forging identities rooted in both land and tradition. Meanwhile, the everyday experiences of peasants, farmers, and tradespeople tied them to the cycles of agricultural labor, local festivities, and community ties. The monarchy served as a stabilizing influence that upheld laws, dispensed justice, and protected the realm from external threats. However, the weakening health of King Edward the Confessor, who had no direct heir, provoked whispers of crisis and opportunity among those with royal ambitions. This climate of suspense only intensified once his final days became imminent. When King Edward passed away, the door was opened to multiple contenders vying for the crown. Their overlapping claims traced back to family ties, promises whispered behind closed doors, and alliances formed for mutual political gain. While Harold Godwinson, an influential English noble, garnered immediate support within the kingdom, Duke William of Normandy diligently prepared a competing argument based on prior understandings and papal endorsement. News of yet another serious challenger, Harold Hardrada of Norway, fanned further anxiety across the realm. Thus, from the vantage point of January of 1066, England stood on the precipice of major upheaval, as ambitions from within and beyond her shores converged on a single point: the English crown. The traditional power structures of Anglo-Saxon governance were about to meet the dynamic ambitions of European rulers eager to reshape the map of influence. For centuries, England had maintained a cultural identity distinct from the Norman territories across the English Channel. Though both regions were Christian, their modes of administration, military organization, and legal customs diverged. A fundamental question began to emerge. Would the coming conquest lead merely to a change of monarch, or would it transform the English nation at its core? While some in England clung to the hope that the succession might proceed smoothly, others recognized that force of arms was likely inevitable, especially given the strong personalities vying for the throne. What occurred in 1066 still reverberates through discussions of English identity and cultural heritage. The events of that tumultuous year created an enduring legacy in architecture, language, landholding patterns, and law. By the turn of the following century, the realm that emerged bore the mark of a new ruling elite, new aristocratic customs, and a transformed church hierarchy. Yet, even in the face of Norman rule, the vestiges of Anglo-Saxon tradition did not vanish. Rather, they merged and adapted, leading to a blend that shaped England's trajectory in the centuries that followed. At the heart of this monumental story lies the dynamic interplay of personalities and political forces, each determined to secure power in a realm that was a coveted prize for any ambitious ruler. In an era when strength, loyalty, and strategic cunning spelled the difference between dominance and defeat, the confrontations that played out in 1066 were especially fierce. From the fierce shield walls on the battlefield to the behind-the-scenes negotiations among nobles, every moment carried tremendous weight for the future of England. This introduction and overview sets the stage for understanding how the Norman Conquest unfolded. In the chapters to come, we will journey through the mid-11th century European context, delve into the intricacies of Anglo-Saxon governance, and witness how a succession crisis could ignite multiple invasions and decisive battles. 1050 Europe in the mid-11th century. In the middle years of the 11th century, Europe was a patchwork of principalities, kingdoms, duchies, and ecclesiastical territories, each with its own ambitions and vulnerabilities. The power of the Holy Roman Emperor, centered in regions that would later become Germany and northern Italy, loomed large, while the papacy in Rome sought to steer the moral and spiritual destiny of the continent. Normandy, ruled by dukes who were simultaneously vassals of the French king and fiercely independent leaders, emerged as a strong force during this period. As the new millennium's first 5 decades passed, Normandy's militaristic culture and political savvy positioned it well to intervene in neighboring regions, including England. Trade routes in the mid-11th century wove together distant locales from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, creating not just an exchange of goods, but also a flow of ideas and cultural influences. Seafaring powers like the Norse kingdoms still commanded respect, and Viking excursions into the British Isles and continental Europe were not a distant memory. Regions like Flanders thrived on maritime commerce, and their leaders played delicate balancing acts with both France and the Holy Roman Empire. Kings of the time needed to secure alliances not only through treaties, but also through strategic marriages, meticulously arranged to consolidate power, quell rebellions, or ensure successions. Although borders were frequently in flux, with shifting loyalties and periodic disputes erupting into open conflict, the Catholic Church provided a unifying cultural influence across much of Western Europe. Monasteries and bishoprics held not just spiritual authority, but also significant land and wealth, enabling them to shape local politics. Bishops might mediate disputes between feuding nobles or help an ambitious duke win favor from distant courts. As a result, the papacy often acted as a kingmaker, endorsing or repudiating rulers in ways that could legitimize or undermine their claims. In the case of William, Duke of Normandy, that papal endorsement would prove crucial when he set his sights on the English crown. Normandy, in particular, had grown formidable since the 10th century. The descendants of Viking settlers, famously led by Rollo, who extracted concessions from the king of the Franks, had embraced feudal traditions, Christian faith, and a keen sense for political opportunities. By the mid-11th century, Norman nobles were experienced in warfare, siegecraft, and castle building. Their cavalry tactics, rooted in swift-moving knights trained for both pitched battles and smaller-scale skirmishes, were advanced compared to many of their neighbors. This martial prowess would soon be on display across the English Channel. Across the North Sea, the Norwegian kingdom also cast a watchful eye on potential conquests. Viking heritage sustained a tradition of seafaring, raiding, and power projection far beyond Scandinavian shores. Rulers like Harold Hardrada epitomized the warrior king archetype, a man equally at home commanding fleets as he was leading armies on land. The reappearance of Norwegian ambitions in the British Isles during the 11th century arose from these deep roots of exploration and conquest, making the mid-11th century a time of contested aspirations across multiple northern European polities. England itself, though wealthy and relatively stable, was not isolated from these continental dynamics. Merchant vessels, immigrant communities, and political marriages fostered ties with Normandy and Flanders, while ancient links to Scandinavia persisted from the era of the Danelaw. Through these connections, the events swirling around Western Europe inevitably impacted English politics. An ambitious ruler across the Channel could assess the kingdom's vulnerabilities, choose a favorable moment, and launch a campaign for the English throne, especially if disputes over succession created a power vacuum. Thus, Europe in the mid-11th century was a stage brimming with potential for dramatic realignments of power. Normandy's rise, papal influence, the lingering might of the Norse, and England's wealth and governance collectively shaped the opportunities and risks that culminated in the Norman Conquest. Understanding this rich backdrop helps explain how a succession crisis in England would be met with such determined and well-organized invasions from multiple quarters, turning one kingdom's internal struggle into a broader continental affair. 1055 Anglo-Saxon England before 1066. Before the watershed year of 1066, Anglo-Saxon England had developed a distinctive system of governance, culture, and religious life. The monarchy generally worked hand in hand with the Witan, a council of nobles and clergy who who offered counsel on matters of law, succession, and political strategy. This collaboration did not always run smoothly. Ambitions clashed, and personal rivalries could lead to dramatic power shifts. But the Witan provided a framework for decision-making that was often respected. Across the shires, local officials like sheriffs enforced the king's writ, sustaining a semblance of centralized control that was unusual for the time. Economically, England enjoyed advantages that made it a prize worth fighting for. Fertile farmlands, reliable harvests, and established trade routes all contributed to the kingdom's prosperity. Silver coinage, minted in recognized royal mints, facilitated commerce and tax collection, giving the Anglo-Saxon crown a more sophisticated financial system than many of its neighbors. Monasteries, with their accumulated wealth and cultural influence, also played a role in stabilizing local economies by funding church construction, charity, and scholarship. Despite occasional raids from across the sea, Anglo-Saxon England had largely emerged from the chaos of earlier Viking invasions with a renewed strength and sense of identity. Socially, the kingdom was stratified into classes that included earls, thegns, eorls, and slaves. Loyalty to one's lord underpinned military organization. Thegns provided armed service in exchange for grants of land, and they, in turn, could call upon lesser retainers. This hierarchical structure formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon defense, most famously manifesting in the shield wall tactic that required discipline and unity among foot soldiers. In religious matters, the Roman Catholic tradition had woven itself deeply into English life, but many local customs and saintly traditions gave the faith a distinctly insular flavor, nurtured by remote monasteries and the hermits who dotted the countryside. Despite the outward appearance of unity, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy faced perpetual challenges. The throne changed hands through both hereditary means and political maneuvering, and the powerful earldoms, like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, could assert enormous influence. Rivalries between leading families, particularly the Godwinsons, often shaped the direction of national policy. As earls jostled for prestige, alliances formed and broke in quick succession, occasionally threatening the monarchy's cohesiveness. Geographically, England's varied landscapes also shaped local identities. The heavily settled and economically dynamic southeast contrasted with the more rugged and independent north, where Norse cultural elements lingered from past settlements. In the west, border conflicts with Wales required their own careful management. The monarchy walked a delicate line, ensuring that each region felt represented while also keeping rebellious tendencies in check. These regional complexities would play a role in the rebellions that followed the Norman Conquest, highlighting the challenges any king faced when seeking to rule the entire realm. By the mid-11th century, England's population had grown significantly, and market towns were emerging as centers of trade and craftsmanship. London, in particular, was fast becoming a major hub, providing opportunities for merchants and artisans, while also serving as a seat of royal power. Town charters and borough liberties indicated a level of urban autonomy and sophistication rarely matched elsewhere in Europe. This blend of rural strength and urban prosperity attracted admiration, envy, and the attention of would-be conquerors. In the final analysis, Anglo-Saxon England before 1066 was a realm with robust institutions, a thriving economy, and deep cultural roots. Yet the strength of its institutions could not protect it from the complexities of succession and external ambition. When the crisis of 1066 arrived, these carefully built structures would be tested as never before, setting the stage for sweeping change that would transform both governance and identity for centuries to come. 1042, the reign of Edward the Confessor. When Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, ascended the English throne in 1042, he inherited a kingdom still finding its balance after decades of shifting rulers and external threats. Born in exile, he had spent a considerable portion of his life in Normandy, which left a lingering impact on his tastes, his advisors, and his strategic alliances. Upon returning to England, Edward sought to strengthen royal authority while navigating the entrenched power of influential families like the Godwinsons. His early years as monarch were marked by cautious diplomacy aimed at consolidating his position and fostering stability across the realm. Edward's moniker, the Confessor, stemmed from his pious nature and devotion to religious life. Throughout his reign, he commissioned churches and religious establishments, promoting the expansion of monastic communities that would become centers of learning and spiritual reform. His focus on building an enduring religious legacy can be seen in his dedication to Westminster Abbey, which he rebuilt on a grand scale, drawing upon architectural styles he had encountered on the continent. This dedication to ecclesiastical projects earned him reverence among clergy and the common faithful alike. Though some nobles found his religious zeal at odds with the pressing martial and administrative concerns of the kingdom. Despite his apparent gentleness in matters of faith, Edward's political reign was not devoid of controversy. The formidable Earl Godwin and his sons, particularly Harold and Tostig, wielded immense power in the southern and northern parts of England. Edward, seeking a balance between rewarding Norman allies and appeasing the English nobility, often faced resistance to his decisions, culminating in outright conflicts when the Godwin family challenged the influence of the king's Norman favorites. At one point, Edward banished Earl Godwin, only to see him return stronger than ever, forcing the king to negotiate for the sake of stability. Edward's childless marriage to Edith, herself a daughter of the Godwin family, became the central thread that would lead to a succession crisis after his death. As the years wore on, it became increasingly clear that there would be no direct heir from the royal couple. This reality set off quiet but persistent discussions about who would inherit the throne. The absence of a clear successor was especially fraught given the powerful nobles within England and the foreign contenders who believed they had claims. William of Normandy, in particular, cultivated a personal conviction that Edward had promised him the English crown, a notion that would have colossal consequences once the king passed away. As Edward's health declined in the early 1060s, speculation grew regarding his intentions and alleged oaths. The king, having spent a significant part of his life at the Norman court, had personal bonds with William that went beyond mere diplomatic niceties. Some chroniclers, writing much later, claimed that Edward had indeed expressed a wish for William to succeed him. Others insisted that the Witan possessed the authority to select the new monarch, and that Edward's personal preferences were secondary to the collective will of English nobility. Despite the uncertainties surrounding the succession, Edward maintained a semblance of stability in governance up until his final days. Under his watch, England experienced relatively few large-scale invasions, allowing for the kingdom's economy and administrative structures to mature. In addition, the culture of piety he encouraged gave rise to new saints' cults and a flowering of church art and architecture. By the close of Edward's reign, Westminster Abbey stood not just as a physical monument to his devotion, but also as a symbol of the interplay between royal authority and religious prestige. When the king breathed his last in January of 1066, he left a kingdom that was spiritually enriched but politically vulnerable. England now faced the daunting task of settling its succession with only a handful of clues about Edward's true wishes. The tension between local governance and foreign ambitions, between Anglo-Saxon tradition and Norman ties, was about to erupt into a struggle that would draw in forces from all over northern Europe. Edward's legacy, thus, became inseparable from the events that followed, sealing his name in the annals of history as the monarch whose death triggered the Great Norman Conquest. 1061 Contenders to the Throne. By the early 1060s, the question of who would inherit the English throne became a matter of intense speculation, not just within the royal court, but throughout the broader tapestry of nobles and foreign allies. For many in England, Harold Godwinson emerged as a leading figure. His lineage, influence, and reputation for leadership made him a natural candidate in the eyes of numerous earls, bishops, and local dignitaries. Additionally, his status as Edward the Confessor's brother-in-law granted him a unique foothold in the corridors of power. However, Harold's notability was far from unchallenged. William, Duke of Normandy, had cultivated his own claim, believing he was promised the English crown by Edward, whose Norman connections ran deep. According to Norman chroniclers, Edward had recognized William's rightful inheritance during a period when the English king sought the support of Normandy. Though this promise was disputed in England, William staunchly held it as valid, gathering Norman nobles who shared his ambition of expanding their sphere of influence across the Channel. Beyond these two prominent claimants, another formidable contender took shape in Harold Hardrada of Norway. As a seasoned warrior and leader, Hardrada traced a distant claim through earlier Norse kings who had briefly ruled portions of England. His formidable reputation, earned on battlefields across Europe, made him a potential champion for those in the north who still remembered the days of Viking dominion. Domesday Godwinson, Harold's disaffected brother, would see in Hardrada a means to reclaim his own lost power, forging an unlikely partnership that would bring Norway's armies to English shores. The interplay of these three claims, English, Norman, and Norwegian, was fueled by both genuine ties and opportunistic maneuvering. Harold Godwinson argued that the Witan had the moral and legal right to determine the successor, claiming that no foreign pledge could override the authority of England's established customs. William countered that Edward's promise was binding and that papal support, which he sought to secure, would legitimize his bid in the eyes of Christendom. Hardrada, meanwhile, believed his conquest would restore the old Viking claims, forging a powerful kingdom that stretched across the North Sea. Tensions escalated as each faction began mustering resources. Harold Godwinson consolidated his relationships with English nobles, working to ensure that if he were crowned, he would command a united realm. William expanded his alliances within Normandy and beyond, investing in a navy and cavalry that could cross the Channel in force. Hardrada marshaled ships for an invasion that might take advantage of England's initial focus on the Norman threat. As rumors spread of impending conflict, the English population braced itself for a scale of warfare few could remember in their lifetimes. Even within England, loyalties were not uniform. Some earls in the north resented the southern dominance of Harold's family. Others feared the political upheaval that might follow a foreign invasion, but were unsure which foreign claimant would be less disruptive. Merchant communities, especially in places like London, had pragmatic concerns. Would a new king uphold trade agreements, maintain coinage standards, and protect vital shipping routes? Monasteries, for their part, prayed for stability, but often hedged their bets by maintaining good relations with multiple claimants. As 1066 approached, these claims set the stage for an extraordinary series of events. The pursuit of the crown no longer confined itself to quiet negotiations and subtle maneuvering. It became a matter of armies on the move. The personalities of Harold, William, and Hardrada were not just symbolic. Each was a seasoned leader capable of inspiring or coercing support from major power brokers. Their rivalries threatened to tear the kingdom apart, but they also elevated the drama to a grand scale that would forever imprint 1066 in the historical consciousness of England and beyond. 1066, the death of Edward the Confessor. In early January of 1066, Edward the Confessor lay gravely ill at his palace in Westminster. Surrounded by close advisors, courtiers, and a concerned clergy, he slipped in and out of consciousness, according to chroniclers. Although he had no direct heir, many believed he favored his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, as the most suitable candidate to lead the nation. Others whispered that Edward remained loyal to William of Normandy. Against this backdrop of uncertainty, the king's health rapidly declined, leaving the realm anxious and on the brink of momentous change. When Edward passed away on the 5th day of January, a hush fell over the court and throughout the kingdom. Mourners and officials gathered around Westminster Abbey to pay their respects, aware that the royal line was now dangerously exposed. Edward's legacy as a devout king overshadowed the immediate, pressing concern of who would inherit the crown. Funeral rites took place swiftly, accompanied by an outpouring of grief among the populace, who had come to appreciate the king's religious fervor and peaceful rule, notwithstanding the political intrigues of his reign. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, the Witan assembled to make a critical decision. According to many sources, they swiftly elected Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, as the new king. Harold's coronation occurred even before Edward was laid to rest, a testament to the urgency felt by English nobles who feared a power vacuum might allow foreign claimants to invade uncontested. The ceremony took place in Westminster, lending it the solemnity of a sacred venue, though it also underlined just how decisive and rapid the succession process had become. This move unsettled those who believed Edward had promised the crown to William of Normandy. In Normandy, upon receiving news of Harold's coronation, William interpreted it as a breach of faith and an affront to legitimate inheritance. He wasted no time in rallying his barons, knights, and clergy, forging a united front that would soon set its sights on England's shores. Meanwhile, Harold sought to consolidate his position by touring parts of his realm, winning over local support and positioning forces strategically in case of invasion. Yet the shockwaves from Edward's death spread beyond Normandy. In Norway, Harold Hardrada observed that the English crown was in dispute and that the new king might be vulnerable. Hardrada's allies, including Domesday Godwinson, encouraged him to take advantage of this transitional period. Quiet preparations began for a Norwegian incursion, with fleets being equipped, soldiers recruited, and alliances confirmed. Harold Godwinson could not ignore the multiple threats closing in. Every day brought fresh rumors of Norwegian or Norman warships. Correspondence with local earls in Northumbria and Mercia revealed unease in the northern territories, where the memory of Viking rule still lingered. Harold's newly formed administration had to strike a delicate balance between addressing domestic governance, issuing royal charters, managing taxes, and overseeing justice, and preparing a defensive strategy to handle possible invasions from two formidable foreign leaders. Edward the Confessor's death thus became the pivotal catalyst that thrust England onto a perilous path. In losing a pious king who had maintained relative peace, the realm gained an embattled monarchy, forced to defend its legitimacy on multiple fronts. By January's end, the unstoppable momentum toward conflict had taken hold. The stage was set for a series of dramatic encounters, including two major invasions that would forever change the destiny of Anglo-Saxon England. 1066, William's preparation for invasion. As word of Harold Godwinson's swift coronation spread across the Channel, William of Normandy felt both outraged and invigorated. In his mind, England's crown rightfully belonged to him, promised by Edward the Confessor and sanctioned by deeper familial ties. With his long-standing ambition now crystallized, he commenced an intense campaign of preparation. The Norman duchy buzzed with activity, as lords from every corner answered William's call to assemble ships, knights, and supplies. Castles and estates throughout Normandy contributed men and material, spurred on by William's assurances of land grants and riches once England fell under his control. William skillfully sought papal backing, knowing that support from Rome would bolster his legitimacy in the eyes of Christian Europe. Contemporary accounts suggest that envoys journeyed to meet Pope Alexander II, laying out William's claim and framing Harold's coronation as an act of betrayal. They emphasized that Harold had allegedly sworn an oath on sacred relics, pledging to uphold William's succession. However, the exact details of that oath remain shrouded in the haze of rival propaganda. Regardless, William's diplomatic outreach convinced the Pope to lend his endorsement, and it is said that the papal banner was sent to accompany the Norman army, granting their invasion the aura of a divinely sanctioned endeavor. The resources needed for a cross-channel invasion were immense. Shipbuilders in Norman ports labored tirelessly to construct or refit hundreds of vessels capable of carrying heavy cavalry, infantry, archers, and siege equipment. Each landing craft needed to be stout enough to survive the unpredictable weather of the English Channel, yet agile enough to deliver troops efficiently onto hostile shores. Soldiers were outfitted with chainmail hauberks, conical helmets, and kite-shaped shields, forming a well-equipped and disciplined force. Meanwhile, Norman knights drilled daily in cavalry maneuvers, perfecting the tactics that would later prove pivotal on English battlefields. Financing this endeavor was no simple feat. William secured loans and levied extraordinary taxes on his duchy, but he also relied on promises of future spoils. The lure of English land and wealth attracted adventurers from beyond Normandy's borders, some from Brittany, others from Flanders, and even opportunists from southern France, each hoping to share in the glory and gain of a successful conquest. This polyglot host, though sometimes fractious, was united under William's leadership, and the promise of monumental rewards once the English defenses collapsed. Throughout the summer of 1066, William maintained a tense watch on the weather and on reports from across the Channel. He understood the timing had to be perfect. An early departure might lead to storms at sea, risking catastrophic losses. A delayed embarkation could allow Harold Godwinson to strengthen coastal defenses or even launch a preemptive strike. William's intelligence network informed him that Harold, uncertain of when and where the Normans might land, had mustered forces along the south coast, forcing William to consider various landing sites that would give him a strategic advantage upon arrival. The moral component of William's campaign was not overlooked. Preachers throughout Normandy proclaimed that God was on their side, painting Harold as a perjurer who had violated sacred promises. This narrative helped maintain discipline among William's ranks and quelled any doubts about the righteousness of the impending invasion. Knights and foot soldiers alike were encouraged to view the expedition not merely as a land grab, but as a mission to uphold justice and restore a rightful claim. By late September of 1066, the wind shifted. William recognized his moment had come. A massive fleet, painstakingly prepared over many months, set sail from the Norman coast with William at its head. The tapestry of war was now woven. William the Bastard, as he was sometimes mockingly called by rivals, was determined to land in England as William the Conqueror. The clash that followed would transform not just the realm across the water, but the entire course of medieval European history. 1066, the Norwegian invasion. While William of Normandy readied his fleet, another mighty force converged upon England from the north. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, was reputed to be a giant of a man in both stature and reputation. Having fought as a mercenary in distant lands, he returned to Norway determined to make a final bid for the English throne, resting his claim on a lineage that stretched back to earlier Viking rulers of Northumbria. Yet Hardrada did not act alone. He found a valuable ally in Domesday Godwinson, the disgruntled brother of King Harold. Exiled and eager for revenge, Domesday stoked Hardrada's ambition, promising that a Norwegian invasion would find support among disaffected northern earls. Throughout the late summer of 1066, Hardrada assembled his war fleet. Longships with carved prows glided through Norwegian fjords, carrying hardened warriors who had grown up in the tradition of Viking raids. These troops were adept in both naval and land combat, armed with broad axes, swords, and the classic round Viking shield. Hardrada's confidence swelled with each new band of fighters that joined his ranks. Convinced that the weaknesses in England's northern defenses would yield a quick and triumphant campaign. As the formidable Norwegian fleet reached the coasts of Northumbria, local forces, led by the Earls Edwin and Morcar, rushed to meet them. The ensuing battle at Fulford, fought outside the city of York, proved devastating for the English defenders. Hardrada's skillful tactics and Domesday's knowledge of local terrain contributed to a resounding Norwegian victory. York, one of England's principal northern cities, found itself at the mercy of Hardrada, and a sense of dread spread among the populace who feared the return of a Viking yoke. Harold Hardrada's early success emboldened him, and he believed that northern England might readily fall under his rule. Yet, even amid these triumphs, he could not forget the looming threat of an English counterattack. Harold Godwinson, now fully aware of the Norwegian invasion, was forced to make a critical decision. Expecting William of Normandy to strike from the south, Harold nevertheless abandoned his coastal watch to march north at breakneck speed in an attempt to confront Hardrada before the region was lost entirely. This strategic gamble would become one of the defining moments of Harold's short reign. Meanwhile, Hardrada and Domesday demanded hostages and supplies from the local population, a common Viking practice to secure new territories without further bloodshed. They chose Stamford Bridge as the meeting point, convinced that the local leadership would yield rather than face another crushing defeat. Confidence soared within the Norwegian ranks, with soldiers recounting glorious victories of the past. Certain that their success against Edwin and Morcar heralded an inevitable domination of all northern England. In a shocking turn of events, Harold Godwinson's forces arrived at Stamford Bridge with remarkable speed, catching the Norwegians off guard. The encounter that followed on the 25th day of September was fierce and bloody, culminating in a decisive victory for the English king. Hardrada was killed in the fray, his ambitions forever extinguished on that battlefield. Tostig likewise met his end, ensuring that the immediate threat from the north was quelled. However, this triumph came at a tremendous cost, as Harold's forces were left exhausted and depleted. In the wake of Stamford Bridge, England heaved a momentary sigh of relief, believing that the greatest threat had been subdued. Celebrations of victory and the retrieval of spoils turned bittersweet, as the kingdom's northern regions lay ravaged, and the king's army found itself in dire need of rest and reinforcements. The timing of the Norwegian invasion, concluding so close to William's impending landing in the south, proved critical. By repelling Hardrada, Harold Godwinson had shown his capabilities as a commander, but he had also put himself in a precarious position. His ranks were worn down, and another invasion loomed on the horizon, casting a long shadow over England's future. 1066 Norman landing in England. Not long after the English victory at Stamford Bridge, the winds that had held William's fleet in Normandy shifted, allowing a massive flotilla to cross the Channel. Within days, the Normans set foot on English soil at Pevensey Bay. The date was late September of 1066, coinciding cruelly with the aftermath of Harold Godwinson's grueling march north and back south again. William's army wasted no time constructing makeshift fortifications, using wooden palisades, ditches, and a repurposed Roman fort to secure their beachhead. Local inhabitants fled or surrendered as the Normans seized supplies and ensured their initial foothold was unassailable. William acted swiftly to gather intelligence on the state of English defenses. Scouts rode through the surrounding countryside, assessing the loyalties of local communities and the readiness of any nearby resistance. Encouraged by reports that Harold's main force was still in the north, grappling with the aftermath of the Norwegian invasion, William advanced inland. Yet he did not rush blindly. Rather, he established a chain of supply points and defensive positions, intending to draw Harold into a decisive confrontation on terrain more favorable to Norman cavalry. In this early phase of the invasion, discipline among Norman troops proved crucial. William had promised them lands and riches, but he also demanded restraint, aware that wanton destruction could provoke a widespread uprising among English peasants and lesser nobles. While some looting inevitably took place, William's command structure held the army to a relatively orderly advance, hoping to demonstrate both power and a modicum of forbearance. Word of the Norman landing began to spread across England, carried by fleeing villagers and official messengers. Fear rippled through the southern shires, and appeals for assistance made their way to Harold. Far to the north, Harold Godwinson received the news with a sinking heart. His men, though jubilant after the recent victory at Stamford Bridge, were in no condition for a hasty turnaround. Many were injured, some had returned to their homes to recover, and fresh levies needed to be assembled from the shires that had not yet seen combat. Nevertheless, Harold recognized the urgency of confronting William before the Normans could entrench themselves further. He ordered a rapid march southward, gathering whatever forces he could muster along the way, setting the stage for another grueling race across the kingdom. Meanwhile, William established a base near Hastings, fortifying it carefully as a potential rallying point and supply hub. The Normans brought war horses bred for cavalry charges, archers trained to volley arrows over and through shield walls, and foot soldiers skilled in forming cohesive ranks. Each element of William's military machine was designed to function in concert, combining relentless cavalry maneuvers with supportive missile fire and infantry assaults. In the quiet nights before the fateful battle, fires burned across the Norman encampments, and soldiers sharpened their blades, waiting for the inevitable showdown with the Saxon host. Local English nobles around Sussex faced difficult choices. Some prepared to fight alongside Harold, while others considered making terms with William in hopes of retaining their lands. Rumors circulated that William carried the papal banner, suggesting divine favor for the Norman cause. For the devout or the merely superstitious, this reinforced the sense that resisting William might be akin to defying the will of the Church. Nonetheless, pockets of defiance persisted. as local militias formed to defend their villages against marauding bands of Norman troops. By early October, two armies stood poised for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the English crown. Harold's swift march south, orchestrated in part by determination and in part by desperation, set the stage for a critical engagement. William, confident in his strategy and bolstered by papal approval, awaited the Saxon king with unwavering resolve. Both leaders understood that the coming clash was more than just a fight for territory. It was a contest to determine who would shape the future of England. 1066, the approach to Hastings. As the days of early October of 1066 slipped away, two formidable armies inched closer to the small town of Hastings. Harold Godwinson and his battle-worn forces had marched with remarkable speed from Stamford Bridge to London, gathering reinforcements as they advanced. Though many soldiers remained fatigued and short on supplies, the morale among Harold's ranks was emboldened by their recent triumph over the Norwegians. The king believed that he must strike quickly, denying William the chance to fortify further or to gain local allies who might be swayed by Norman promises and threats. On the other side, William's troops continued their preparatory drills around Hastings, refining cavalry charges and ranged tactics. Scouts reported back on the terrain between Hastings and the inland roadways. The land itself, composed of rolling hills, dense woods, and scattered fields, presented unique tactical considerations. Norman cavalry would be most effective on relatively open ground where horses could charge, whereas the Anglo-Saxon shield wall excelled in narrower, more constrained spaces. William knew that if he could draw Harold onto ground favorable to horses, the Norman knights would have a significant edge. Harold's approach from London involved both urgency and caution. Along the route, the English king ordered small contingents to reconnoiter the countryside, ensuring that no Norman detachments lay in wait. The distance to the south coast tested the stamina of every man in the Saxon host. Feet blistered, provisions thinned, and nights passed in uncomfortable camps. Harold himself was said to stand at the center of this forced march, eating sparingly and urging his men forward with the conviction that the fate of their kingdom depended on their resolve to meet the invaders head-on. Messages traveled between local earls, sheriffs, and the king's retinue, coordinating the arrival of additional levies. In some regions, the harvest demanded immediate attention, making it difficult to muster all able-bodied men. Nevertheless, a steady stream of thens and furred volunteers, armed with spears, axes, and round shields, poured into Harold's camp. The total size of his army still lagged behind the Norman forces, but the Saxons believed their familiarity with local terrain and their unwavering sense of defending their homeland would even the odds. William closely observed these developments. Some chroniclers suggest he dispatched small raiding parties to tempt Harold into a premature engagement or to gauge the responsiveness of English forces. Others claim that William used diplomacy to test local loyalties, offering favorable terms to any who would swear fealty to him in advance of the battle. The net effect was a state of heightened tension across Sussex, with farmsteads barricaded and villagers torn between fear of the Normans and hope in Harold's impending arrival. In these final days before the historic clash, both leaders addressed their men. Harold reportedly invoked the valor displayed at Stamford Bridge, urging his troops to show equal courage against this new invader. William reminded his soldiers of the papal blessing and the justice of their cause, contending that Harold was a usurper who had broken sacred oaths. On the eve of the battle, each side prepared in its own way. The Normans in well-organized encampments with watchful sentries, and the Saxons in makeshift positions, aware that dawn might bring the final reckoning. By the close of that anxious night, the lines of destiny were drawn. Harold understood that defeating William decisively was the only way to secure his crown and validate his succession. William, equally resolved, believed that victory would forever enshrine him as the rightful monarch of England and open the gates to a kingdom rich in land, revenue, and prestige. All that remained was for the armies to meet in battle, an event that would echo through the ages as one of the most pivotal turning points in the annals of English history. 1066, the Battle of Hastings. The dawn of the 14th day of October, in 1066, arrived with a sense of grim anticipation on both sides of the battlefield near the hill north of Hastings. King Harold Godwinson's forces stood in a tightly formed shield wall, having taken up a defensive position on higher ground. Their morale was tempered by weariness, for many among them had marched relentlessly from the north after defeating the Norwegian invasion. Nonetheless, the men believed that their natural advantage in holding the ridge would help offset Norman cavalry and archer assaults. As Harold surveyed his ranks, he saw in them the same resolve that had carried them through recent struggles, fueling his confidence that they could hold fast against this new threat. Below the ridge, William of Normandy's army was methodically organized into three main components: archers in the front, foot soldiers in the middle, and mounted knights in the rear. A hush fell as William's men made last-minute adjustments to armor, saddles, and arrows. Some records speak of William urging his troops to fight bravely for their rightful claim and reminding them of the papal banner carried into battle. His formation reflected a reliance on combined arms: missiles to soften the enemy lines, infantry to press the assault, and cavalry to deliver the final decisive blow. It was a system refined by Norman warfare in previous continental engagements. As the initial volley of arrows rained down, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall stood firm, raising interlocked shields that reduced many arrows to harmless rattles on wood and metal. However, the real test began when William ordered his infantry forward. Norman foot soldiers, armed with spears and swords, clashed headlong against the Saxon line. The shield wall held, propelled by the fierce loyalty of Harold's housecarls, who were renowned for their skill with the battle axe. Though both sides suffered casualties, neither gained a decisive advantage in those early hours. What followed became one of the most iconic maneuvers of medieval warfare. Facing fierce resistance, William's cavalry advanced, but struggled to break the stalwart Saxons. Sensing that frustration was setting in, William utilized a tactic sometimes called the feigned retreat. Portions of his cavalry pretended to flee in disarray, drawing sections of the Saxon line downhill in pursuit. In that moment of confusion and enthusiasm for a perceived rout, the integrity of the shield wall fractured. The Normans then wheeled around and cut through the now exposed Saxons. This cunning maneuver was repeated, further destabilizing Harold's once solid formation. As midday slipped into afternoon, the battle grew more ferocious. The Norman knights, emboldened by their partial successes, pressed harder. Some chroniclers recount that William himself had to lift his helmet at one point to show his men he was still alive, as rumors of his death had started to spread in the chaos of combat. On the English side, Harold fought doggedly amidst the swirl of conflict, trying to rally and reorder his forces, but the shield wall was significantly weakened. In those final pivotal moments, the king himself was mortally wounded. Later chroniclers would describe an arrow striking his eye, though the exact details are debated. With Harold gone, the Saxon defense swiftly collapsed, leaving William's forces victorious upon the field. In the aftermath of the confrontation, bodies blanketed the slopes and the ground was soaked with blood. Survivors from the English side scattered, fleeing to protect their homes or to regroup and swear loyalty elsewhere. This one day of ferocious combat had effectively decided England's fate. William's success at Hastings was not the end of the struggle. Pockets of resistance would flare up, but it was the stroke that shattered Harold's defense and left the road to London open. From that moment, 1066 would forever be tied to the transformation of England under Norman rule. 1066, Aftermath of Hastings. In the days immediately following the Battle of Hastings, William of Normandy and his leading captains took careful stock of their position. Though the Norman victory had been decisive, the landscape remained potentially hostile. The local populace, while reeling from the defeat of their king, could still rise against invaders if provoked. William understood the importance of consolidating his power through a balanced combination of military force and political acumen. He issued orders to secure the countryside, stationing garrisons in strategic locations around Hastings and the surrounding region to curb any spark of rebellion. Meanwhile, the remaining Saxon nobles confronted grim decisions. Some had lost friends and relatives on the battlefield. Others faced uncertainty about whether to resist the Norman encroachment or to seek terms. In many cases, the utter shock of Harold Godwinson's death and the lack of a unified alternative monarchy led to divisions among the Saxon earls. Some powerful figures openly submitted to William, hoping to protect their lands and retain a measure of authority under the new regime. Others clung to hopes that an alternative claimant could be found, but there was no consensus on who that might be. Word of the massive defeat and Harold's demise traveled quickly to London, where leaders and common people alike wrestled with a sense of incredulity. Early attempts to muster a new defense were disorganized and lacked the strong leadership that Harold had provided. The royal treasury and armories remained an asset, but forging a unified front so soon after the catastrophic loss at Hastings proved exceedingly difficult. Many Saxon warriors who survived were either traumatized by the scale of the slaughter or dispirited at having lost both a king and much of their veteran housecarl force. William did not rush straight to London, instead choosing to march carefully through the southern shires, capturing important towns and strongholds. Each conquest paved the way for him to replenish his supplies and fortify his position against any counterattack. In the process, he sometimes allowed for negotiations with local authorities, with the caveat that they must swear fealty to him or risk the destructive wrath of his army. This strategy gradually undermined any meaningful resistance, as influential Saxon families began to see the futility of open warfare against the well-organized Norman ranks. The first wave of Norman administrative changes started quietly in the weeks after Hastings. William appointed loyal followers to watch over the newly subdued territories, granting them land and titles in return for their allegiance. While the broader conquest was far from complete, these initial gestures signaled the beginning of the transfer of wealth and influence from the Saxon elite to Norman newcomers. Many local peasants and townspeople, though wary, found little choice but to adapt, hoping to preserve their livelihoods under the watch of foreign lords. These uneasy dynamics set the stage for deeper, more systematic transformations that would unfold over subsequent months and years. In this climate of shifting allegiances and sudden uncertainty, the final weeks of 1066 revealed both the fragility of English power structures and the determined resolve of William. Saxon earls who might have united against the Normans struggled to coordinate, and some simply saw no path forward other than to capitulate. That sense of inevitability echoed beyond the fields of Hastings, marking a gradual transition of authority that would culminate in William's coronation and the broad remaking of Anglo-Saxon England. 1066 March on London. With the southern roads beginning to fall under Norman control, William turned his gaze toward the ultimate prize, the city of London. Strategically and symbolically, London was the key to solidifying his claim to the English throne. By late autumn of 1066, Norman forces had secured enough territory to contemplate the daunting move inland. Still, William refused to be reckless. He was keenly aware that London boasted defenses, and any direct assault could prove costly if the city's defenders were prepared for a siege. In a series of deliberate moves, William circled around the capital rather than confronting it head-on. The Normans took vital choke points and bridges, maneuvering in such a way as to cut off potential supply routes into London. William aimed to starve the city's ability to resist, while simultaneously demonstrating the might of his army to any who still held hopes of preventing his coronation. Each town that surrendered without a fight further expanded William's domain, granting him additional manpower and resources. Within London, panic mingled with staunch resolve. News of the Norman approach caused some citizens to flee, carrying their valuables or seeking refuge in monasteries and castles beyond the immediate route of invasion. Others remained, determined to preserve their properties and businesses. The city's nobility argued among themselves about whether to negotiate with William or attempt a last stand. They recognized that the Saxon monarchy was in disarray, but pride and long-standing traditions inclined many to resist this foreign claimant who came proclaiming divine approval for his cause. During these tense weeks, William employed diplomatic overtures alongside the fearsome reputation of his army. Envoys were sent to London with messages urging submission to the rightful king. These entreaties offered leniency in return for loyalty, emphasizing that William held no intention of destroying the city if it bowed to his authority. As in other regions, William's method blended the reality of potential devastation with the prospect of stability under a new regime. For citizens who had already suffered the economic disruption of war, the notion of a stable, prosperous future under Norman rule held a certain appeal, however begrudgingly. In time, the ring of Norman control tightened around London. Its leaders, seeing the futility of attempting a prolonged siege, began negotiating terms. Elders, bishops, and influential merchants all contributed to the debate, weighing the city's capacity to endure further conflict against the risk of ceding control to a foreign duke. Eventually, the balance tipped in favor of capitulation. With London thus subdued, William's path to coronation lay open, and the tangible process of transforming England's leadership passed a critical milestone. This swift but methodical march on London underscored William's strategic prowess, revealing that conquest was not always about brute force alone, but also about calculated negotiation and psychological dominance. By late December, the stage was set for William to realize his grand aspiration. Through measured tactics, he had neutralized most potential pockets of resistance and secured the nation's largest and most influential city. Remnants of Saxon power still lingered in the countryside, and future rebellions were certain, but for the moment, William held the advantage. Those who had doubted his capacity to capture London without excessive bloodshed now found themselves facing a new reality. The Norman Conquest was no longer a distant threat, but an accomplished fact in the heart of England. 1066 William's coronation. On Christmas Day of 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England in the grand setting of Westminster Abbey. The ceremony, infused with the solemnity of religious observance and the weight of royal tradition, was intended to signal a seamless continuation of England's monarchical line, even as it uprooted Anglo-Saxon authority. High-ranking clergymen, including those aligned with the Norman cause, officiated the crowning to legitimize William's ascension. The event brought together an unusual assembly of Norman knights, English nobles who had submitted, and curious onlookers who crowded into the abbey. Yet this solemn moment was not without tension. Legend states that when the congregation cheered their new king, William's Norman guards outside the abbey misunderstood the raucous shouts, fearing an insurrection. In a burst of panic, they set buildings ablaze around Westminster. The resulting chaos forced some attendees to flee the abbey mid-ceremony, bringing an element of pandemonium to what should have been a purely majestic occasion. Despite the confusion, William was crowned before the altar, solidifying his claim in the eyes of both God and men. The coronation symbolized more than a mere shift in rulers. It marked the fusion, or collision, of Norman and Anglo-Saxon political traditions. By choosing Westminster Abbey, William acknowledged the significance of the place Edward the Confessor had rebuilt and regarded as his spiritual legacy. This continuity lent a veneer of legitimacy to the new regime, implying that while the monarchy's face had changed, the sacred roots of its authority remained. For many English nobles who witnessed the ceremony, the moment evoked a complex mix of resignation, curiosity, and perhaps residual hope that their old privileges might yet be preserved. Despite the grand celebrations, the coronation did not automatically grant William uncontested power throughout the kingdom. Areas such as the Midlands, East Anglia, and the North remained wary, with some local lords prepared to test the limits of William's rule. Nonetheless, the fact that William could orchestrate a royal crowning in England's spiritual heartland within months of his arrival revealed a dramatic shift in power. Many ecclesiastical and secular authorities recognized the inevitability of Norman dominance, and they thus chose to align themselves with the new king, seeking favor and security in an uncertain landscape. In the immediate weeks following his coronation, William took steps to secure his position. He appointed trusted Normans to influential bishoprics and earldoms, signaling that a new aristocracy was in the making. Royal decrees began to integrate elements of Norman administration, especially in military defense and court protocol. With London and Westminster as his base of operations, William embarked on a journey across England, endeavoring to subdue rebellious districts and bring the entire realm under the iron grip of his new kingship. The coronation was the climax of 1066, but it also served as the prologue to sweeping changes that would reshape England's social, political, and cultural landscape for generations. 1067, establishing Norman control. In the months that followed his coronation, William turned from conquest to consolidation. Even as 1066 ended and 1067 began, the kingdom was far from completely subdued. To secure his power, William embarked on a series of systematic policies designed to break remaining pockets of resistance and to transform the upper echelons of English society. Foremost among these measures was the construction of castles, motte and bailey fortifications that sprang up in key strategic points. Towering over townscapes and rural crossroads alike, these fortifications served as visible reminders of Norman strength and a deterrent to rebellion. To fund and maintain these new defenses, William began redistributing lands. Prominent Norman lords and knights who had served faithfully during the invasion were granted large estates that had previously belonged to Saxon nobles. In many cases, the displaced Anglo-Saxon aristocrats were either expelled, stripped of their titles, or forced to submit under humiliating terms. This transfer of land effectively transferred power as economic resources and feudal allegiances moved firmly into Norman hands. The shift undermined any lingering hopes among the Saxon elite for a revival of their old dominance. Simultaneously, William imposed new forms of governance that meshed Norman customs with existing English frameworks. He demanded oaths of fealty from local officials, ensuring that sheriffs, reeves, and thegns would now answer directly to him. In many regions, his Norman deputies oversaw the local courts, sometimes adapting Saxon laws, but always ensuring that the ultimate authority lay with the king. By taking steps to control not only the aristocracy, but also the administrative apparatus, William and his deputies tightened their grip on every facet of society. Still, the transition was not without resistance. Clashes erupted when Saxon nobles refused to relinquish their ancestral lands, leading to skirmishes and occasionally brutal crackdowns by Norman forces. People who fled these conflicts sought refuge in remote areas, like the Fenlands, or even beyond England's borders. Some rebellious leaders dreamed of rallying exiles and outside allies, but without a centralized leadership or strong foreign support, such resistance movements struggled to gain momentum. As William expanded his network of fortifications, each revolt became more difficult to sustain. By the close of 1067, Norman rule over much of southern and eastern England was firmly entrenched, while the rest of the country faced mounting pressure to accept this new reality. Though the conquest had happened swiftly, the transformation of governance was gradual and met with pockets of defiance. Castles rose against the skyline in towns where they had never been seen before, symbolizing a new era of fortification and militarization. This interplay of assertion and submission, of building and occasionally burning, characterized William's determined push to cement Norman power across the breadth of his realm. 1068, Rebellions and Resistance. Despite William's systematic approach to establishing control, his reign met frequent and sometimes fierce pockets of defiance. By the early part of 1068, various parts of England simmered with discontent, particularly in the west and north, where Norman oversight remained weaker. Exeter, a city in the southwest, served as a focal point for early rebellions. The local populace, driven by anger over heavy taxation and the displacement of Saxon nobility, shut the gates against William's representatives. In response, William marched on Exeter with a well-armed force, determined to deliver a clear message that no city was beyond his reach. The siege of Exeter exemplified the complexities of these uprisings. While some citizens supported a stand against Norman rule, others weighed the realities of William's well-fortified armies and the wealth of resources he controlled. After a period of stalemate, Exeter capitulated, and William installed a loyal garrison to maintain order. Tales of Exeter's submission spread, cautioning other towns that outright rebellion risked devastating consequences, including the destruction of property and the seizure of lands. Further north, a different kind of resistance emerged. some Saxon nobles and remnants of local armies banded together under the leadership of regional figures like Harold. Though lacking the power to mount large-scale offensives, they conducted guerrilla-style attacks on Norman outposts, targeting vulnerable supply lines and small garrisons. The Fens, with its marshy terrain, offered a natural refuge for these rebels who knew how to navigate the tricky waterways better than William's forces. These hit-and-run tactics inflicted a psychological toll on Norman authorities, reminding them that total domination of the land was an ongoing struggle. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape also encouraged resistance. The presence of foreign threats, like occasional Danish interest in returning to England, gave hope to rebellious factions that outside intervention could one day tip the scales in their favor. William, for his part, had to monitor these possible alliances, ensuring no foreign power would unite with English rebels against him. He positioned garrisons along coastal areas where an invasion might land, while continuing to fortify major population centers to keep rebellion from flaring beyond containment. By the latter half of 1068, William had quashed many of the immediate revolts, but the seeds of resistance persisted. In some cases, Saxons turned to stealth and covert sabotage, refusing to yield fully to Norman demands. Rumors circulated of hidden stashes of weapons and food, maintained for the day when Saxon rule might be restored. These simmering tensions made it clear that while William might control a large part of England's physical infrastructure, loyalty among the populace remained far from guaranteed. The existence of scattered revolts served as a constant reminder that the kingdom could still slide into turmoil if not carefully managed. 1069, the harrying of the North. In the year 1069, William's attention turned decisively toward the north of England, where insurgencies continued to threaten his authority. The region's history of partial Viking rule and enduring cultural differences made it fertile ground for anti-Norman sentiment. Uprisings flared repeatedly, sometimes aided by Danish forces, who landed brief forays on English shores. In response, William launched what became infamously known as the Harrying of the North, a campaign of suppression marked by ruthless tactics intended to break the spirit of the northern rebels. William's method involved more than direct military confrontation. Norman troops burned farms, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock across wide swaths of territory. These harsh actions ensured that local populations would struggle to support any further rebellions, as the means to feed an army vanished. Entire villages were laid to waste, forcing the survivors into hunger and desperate flight. Contemporaries and later historians alike condemned this level of brutality, which created a humanitarian crisis and left large regions of the North devastated for years. While the immediate effect of this scorched earth strategy was the submission of many rebellious strongholds, the long-term consequences were dire for all involved. Famine took hold among northern communities, and thousands of ordinary people perished from starvation and exposure to the harsh winter. The once thriving agricultural lands of Yorkshire and its surrounds became a mournful landscape of charred ruins. Though these measures quelled active resistance in the short run, they also bred deep-seated resentment that lingered long after William's reign. In the midst of this campaign, William's administration put loyal Norman lords in charge of northern castles and estates. These newly appointed rulers faced the challenge of governing a population that had been terrorized and largely impoverished. While many in the north begrudgingly accepted Norman overlordship, fearing a repeat of the devastation, others nursed ambitions of rebellion, waiting for a more opportune moment to strike. It became apparent that ruling through sheer force, however effective in the short term, had sparked a legacy of bitterness that would shape the North's relations with the crown for generations. By the close of 1069, the harrying of the North had forced the region into submission at a heartbreaking cost. Norman authority appeared unassailable on the surface, with castles emerging from the wreckage to solidify control. But beneath the veneer of forced compliance, local communities smoldered with unresolved anger. This devastation served as a grim testament to the lengths William was willing to go in ensuring the entire realm recognized his kingship. The approach may have stamped out the seeds of immediate rebellion, but it also left a profound scar on England's social and cultural fabric. 1070 Impact on Peasantry. By 1070, England's rural populace, its countless peasants, laborers, and smallholders, bore the brunt of the transformations unleashed by the Norman Conquest. Entire communities that once depended on local Saxon lords now found themselves under the domain of Norman barons or knights who arrived with differing customs and little compassion for established local traditions. The feudal obligations that existed under Anglo-Saxon rule evolved into a stricter, more centralized system, with heavier demands for labor, rent, and service. Peasants often felt powerless as they navigated new chains of command and faced unfamiliar legal procedures. In regions ravaged by military action, such as parts of the north during the harrying, peasants labored under the direst conditions. With crops burned and livestock slaughtered, many families had no choice but to abandon their homesteads and seek refuge elsewhere. Those who remained lived under constant threat of hunger, extortion from roving soldiers, or punitive actions by new lords aiming to crush even the suggestion of disobedience. Displacement and famine became distressingly common, contributing to a sense of upheaval and uncertainty that permeated rural life. Despite these hardships, peasants displayed remarkable resilience. Over time, they adapted to new expectations by learning elements of Norman culture, such as the language of their overlords, at least to the extent needed to conduct basic transactions. Some even found modest opportunities. The Norman appetite for revenue and agricultural surplus led to infrastructure improvements in certain areas, such as more sophisticated mills or regulated markets. While these efforts aimed primarily to increase royal and seigneurial income, a few enterprising peasants managed to benefit through trade or specialized crafts. Nevertheless, the transition often reinforced existing social hierarchies or even introduced stricter divisions between the landholding elite and those bound to work the land. Where Anglo-Saxon customs had sometimes allowed for flexible or communal land arrangements, Norman feudalism introduced a clear hierarchy of vassals and sub-vassals. The obligations of labor, dues, and fees became more rigidly enforced, and the path to upward mobility narrowed. This structural shift contributed to an atmosphere of unrest, fueling undercurrents of resentment that erupted in sporadic local rebellions or acts of sabotage against Norman property. By the end of the first 4 years of Norman rule, the peasantry had emerged as both victims and survivors of monumental change. The imposition of a more regimented feudal system, combined with punitive campaigns in rebellious areas, forced many to accept a new normal. Villages that once functioned relatively independently now found themselves entwined in a broader political drama that reached directly into their daily lives. As castle walls rose in the distance and foreign knights patrolled the byways, the English peasantry learned through harsh necessity that survival meant adapting to a very different world order. 1070 Church reform under the Normans. Alongside the social and political reordering, the Norman Conquest carried profound implications for England's church institutions. By 1070, William and his advisors had begun laying the groundwork for a sweeping transformation of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. One of William's earliest moves was to replace Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with Norman or other continental clergy who owed direct loyalty to him. This realignment enabled the crown to gain greater control over the spiritual life of the kingdom, ensuring that religious authority would not serve as a focal point for Saxon resistance. In the process of reshaping episcopal sees, William invited influential reformers from the continent to assume high office in England. Men like Lanfranc, who would become the Archbishop of Canterbury, strove to bring English religious practices into closer alignment with contemporary European norms. They introduced more rigid standards for the clergy, insisting on celibacy, improved clerical education, and stricter adherence to canonical guidelines. Though these reforms aimed at revitalizing the English Church, they also often sidelined local traditions that many Saxon communities cherished. New church construction projects reflected the changing tides. Romanesque architecture, sometimes referred to as Norman style, began to replace older Anglo-Saxon building methods. Grand cathedrals, monasteries, and abbeys, erected with stone masonry and featuring massive arches, proclaimed the permanence and might of Norman influence. These architectural endeavors not only demonstrated piety, but also served a political function, signifying that the new rulers intended to dominate England as thoroughly in spiritual matters as in secular governance. Clerical appointments and church councils provided another vehicle for consolidating royal authority. As new bishops convened synods, they increasingly pushed through decrees that aligned with William's interests. Priests who resisted were removed or coerced into submission, reinforcing a trend that saw the king exercise more direct oversight over church affairs than his Anglo-Saxon predecessors had traditionally wielded. This centralization proved beneficial for William when confronting ecclesiastical challenges to his policies, as he often found pliable church officials willing to uphold royal decrees. Yet, church reform under the Normans did not go unchallenged. Local monks and parishioners often resented the displacement of native abbots who had deeply rooted connections to their communities. In some abbeys, disputes broke out over the introduction of foreign liturgical customs. While these tensions did not typically escalate to widespread rebellion, they contributed to a general sense of cultural upheaval. Over time, however, many English clerics and laypeople adapted to the new religious realities, blending aspects of Anglo-Saxon spirituality with the Romanesque vigor championed by Norman administrators. This amalgamation would become a defining feature of English church life, even as older generations lamented the passing of their cherished traditions. 1086, the Domesday Book. By 1086, William had been king for 2 decades, and the overarching stability of his reign allowed him to undertake an extraordinary project: a thorough survey of his kingdom's lands, resources, and population. Known to history as the Domesday Book, this massive undertaking sought to catalog who owned which plots of land, how many livestock populated each manor, and what taxes might be levied. It represented an unprecedented administrative feat, reflecting William's desire to centralize authority, maximize revenue, and prevent disputes among his rapidly expanding Norman aristocracy. Compiling the Domesday Book involved royal commissioners traveling across every shire of England. These officials convened local juries of priests, reeves, and villagers who testified under oath about the holdings of each estate before and after the Norman Conquest. The meticulousness of the process showcased the administration's aspiration to leave no corner of the realm undocumented. Royal scribes compiled the data, ultimately producing a record so comprehensive that its name evoked the finality of the Last Judgment. Once the lands were listed and assessed, there was little hope of appeal. For the Saxon nobles, who had managed to retain some property post-conquest, the survey formalized their holdings under Norman law. For the Norman barons, who had received land grants from William, it validated their rights, ensuring they could claim all associated taxes and dues. Peasants, tenants, and smallholders often viewed the commissioner's arrival with trepidation. Many feared that new assessments would lead to increased rents or harsher service obligations. Indeed, in some regions, a marked rise in taxes followed the survey, fueling ongoing resentment toward Norman rule. Yet the Domesday Book did more than serve as a tax ledger. Its very existence solidified the perception of William as a king of unprecedented administrative power. Throughout Europe, no contemporary monarch had compiled such an exhaustive appraisal of a kingdom's resources. This level of oversight sent a clear signal. William's governance extended into every parish, manor, and village. It bound lord and serf, Norman and English, to the central authority of the crown, leaving fewer loopholes for local potentates to exploit. With the completion of the Domesday Book, the infrastructure of Norman governance reached a new pinnacle. While rebellions still flared sporadically and cultural tensions endured, the ability of the crown to assess and collect wealth gave William and his successors a substantial edge in maintaining order. Future administrations would continue to rely on the Domesday Book to resolve property disputes and anchor fiscal policies. Thus, it became one of the most enduring legacies of the conquest, encapsulating a moment in English history when power was consolidated to an extent never before seen. William I's later reign. By 1074, William I's priorities had evolved beyond the immediate conquest and pacification of England. Though he continued to quell sporadic uprisings, his focus shifted toward establishing a stable monarchy that could compete with the power of continental rulers. Aware that England's resources were now at his disposal, he strategized about expanding his influence and possibly reasserting claims in territories across Normandy and beyond. At home, William maneuvered to strengthen the crown's financial base, relying heavily on thorough taxation and land management policies. Despite his success, William's later years were not free from personal and familial challenges. He contended with rebellious nobles, including some who once supported him, but now bristled under the strict terms of feudal obligation. Diplomacy became an essential tool as he negotiated with neighbors such as Scotland, the Welsh princes, and the French king, each seeking advantage while wary of William's growing might. It was a delicate balancing act that required both military readiness and diplomatic finesse. Relations within William's own household also grew complicated. His sons, Robert, Richard, William Rufus, and Henry, came of age, each nursing ambitions that could unsettle the distribution of power. Robert, in particular, argued for greater autonomy in Normandy, leading to a strained relationship with his father. At times, these familial disputes threatened to undermine William's broader vision, forcing the king to walk a fine line between paternal authority and political strategy. In tandem with these internal and external pressures, William showcased moments of administrative brilliance. He reaffirmed the importance of the Domesday Book survey, using its data to arbitrate land disputes and to solidify the crown's grasp on revenue. Officials traveled the kingdom, ensuring that even remote shires adhered to the laws emanating from the royal court. This centralization was unprecedented in its thoroughness, leaving a lasting legacy on English governance. By the end of 1074, William stood as a potentate whose dominion crossed the Channel and spanned a kingdom in flux. The militaristic fervor of the conquest had given way to a more methodical reign, yet tensions still simmered beneath the surface. A single spark in the north, or a familial disagreement, could escalate into a serious crisis. Nonetheless, William I's ability to navigate these challenges underscored his reputation as a complex, forceful, and sometimes ruthless ruler, whose imprint on England would remain for centuries. 1080. Conclusion and reflection. By the dawn of 1080, the Norman Conquest had left an indelible mark on England, permanently altering its governance, society, language, and culture. The battles of 1066 now lay in the collective memory, while the reforms, architectural endeavors, and centralizing of royal power had become ingrained in daily life. Peasants, nobles, and clergymen alike were living in a kingdom shaped by forces that had both disturbed and enriched its fundamental structures, contributing to a tapestry whose threads intertwined Saxon endurance with Norman innovation. This transformation was neither instantaneous nor uniformly accepted. The initial shockwaves, the bloodshed at Hastings, the devastation of the harrying of the north, and the abrupt displacement of local lords lingered as powerful reminders of the costs of conquest. Yet over time, individuals and communities found ways to adapt, combining old traditions with new obligations. The English language itself, shifting under the influence of Norman French, stood as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the kingdom's populace, mirroring the broader cultural negotiation that took place on every level of society. Even as William I and his successors brought England under a tighter royal apparatus, they could not wholly eradicate the diverse heritages that ran through the land. Instead, they unwittingly fostered a hybrid identity, one that would continue to evolve as new generations inherited a land that was both Saxon and Norman in spirit. Castles and cathedrals rose alongside remnants of prior eras, standing not only as monuments to conquest, but also as beacons of a future in which England would become a defining power on the European stage. From ecclesiastical reforms to linguistic growth, the story of the Norman Conquest reveals how upheaval can spark profound renewal. The lasting impact of those fateful events of 1066 can still be glimpsed in enduring place names, the legal system's vestiges, and the grand architectural landmarks that dot the English countryside. Though centuries have passed, the legacy of William and his Norman followers echoes in the foundations of modern England, perpetually reminding us that history is both disruptive and creative. The dramatic saga begun in 1066 and carried through the final decades of the 11th century thus stands as a milestone of change. It reshaped not only who held power, but also how that power was understood and exercised. For better or worse, it forged a new path for a realm that would continue through many twists and turns to grow into the England recognized today. In this sense, the Norman Conquest remains far more than a single battle or a single moment in time. It is a keystone event that forever altered the direction of English history. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.